There are some voices that don't just sing a song, they tear it open, drag the emotion out by hand and throw it into the air for everyone to feel. Joe Cocker had one of those voices, a voice so raw, so unpolished, so utterly human that it could stop a room in its tracks.
He would get the hair out of his eyes and sometimes wipe the sweat away, but I don't think he ever, for 1 second, thought. I mean, really, the music was the force that was coming through him. I don't think he really understood that. I think that he just was music.
But behind the power and the grit was a man who lived one of the most dramatic arcs in modern music. From a Sheffield lad playing pubs, to a global star, to a man on the brink of collapse, to a figure of enormous redemption. His journey is as gripping as any rock and roll tale you'll ever hear. This is the story of Joe Cocker's rise, his fall, the infamous night he spent in an Australian jail cell with a bank robber who owned all his albums, and the long climb back to dignity, calm, and acclaim. Joe Cocker was born as John Robert Cocker on the 20th of May 1944 in Sheffield, a working-class city where steel, grit, and community shaped your life. He didn't grow up dreaming of stardom. He grew up listening to the radio with his older brother, learning to love the blues voices that floated across the airwaves from America. Ray Charles was a favourite. Little Richard too.
You know, like when you think about music, the big attraction always been to me has been black music, you know, because that's where the real soul comes from. You know, the guts that you got. But then take somewhere like, you know, Sheffield or around here, you know. It was just like there was no, I could never think of anything to put into the music out of it, but there must be, I'm sure.
It wasn't long before young Joe was standing in front of mirrors with a hairbrush microphone, trying to emulate those giants. By his teenage years, he was performing in local pubs, first with his brother in a skiffle group, then with a band he fronted under the stage name Vance Arnold. They played covers of Chuck Berry and Ray Charles, grinding out sweaty shows in smoky Sheffield bars filled with noise, beer, and the occasional punch-up. In 1963, Joe and his band opened for the Rolling Stones. In that moment, the idea of a real career stopped being a dream and started feeling like a possibility. It was around this time that Joe teamed up with keyboardist Chris Stainton, who would become his longest-serving musical partner. Together, they worked tirelessly, gigging across the north of England and hoping for a breakthrough. The breakthrough came in 1968. Joe recorded a soul-infused cover of the Beatles with a little help from my friends, slowing it down, injecting it with gospel passion, and singing it as though he was pulling the words up from underground.
What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me?
It shot to #1 in the United Kingdom. Even the Beatles were impressed. But the moment when Joe truly introduced himself to the world came in August 1969 at the Woodstock Festival. Under a grey sky covered in mud, sweat pouring down his face, Joe tore into With a Little Help from My Friends with such intensity that the crowd, all hundreds of thousands of them, seemed to hold its breath.
Well, we're going to leave you with the usual thing. The only thing I can say, as I've said to many people, is this title just about puts it all into focus. It's called With a Little Help from My Friends. Remember it.
His body moved in spasms, like electricity was passing through him.
I don't think he was aware of what he looked like ever. He, you know, he would get the hair out of his eyes and sometimes wipe the sweat away, but I don't think he ever, for 1 second, thought. I mean, really, the music was the force that was coming through him. I don't think he really understood that. I think that he just was music.
To many viewers watching the film of Woodstock later, Joe's performance became one of the defining images of the peace and music era. Overnight, Joe Cocker became a global star.
If Woodstock provided a gathering place for a nation of alienated youth, then Joe Cocker gave Woodstock its national anthem.
On the back of his newfound fame, Joe released a second album and headed to America again in 1970 for what was intended to be a short tour. Instead, it became one of the wildest expeditions in rock history, the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour. With Leon Russell at the helm, the tour ballooned into a travelling rock and roll circus. Dozens of musicians, backing singers, road crew, a full choir, horn players, groupies, and anyone who felt like joining.
What do I do if my love is away?
It was glorious chaos. The shows were explosive. The parties were endless.
Everybody that in that group of people, Mad Dogs and Englishmen, were fabulous. Best people that you could get to play music with. People that not only play well, but play together. They're just a couple of people that don't get along. It shows in the music. I mean, you've got to have a family that are also gifted, and every time you walk onto that stage together or the studio together, you're constantly rising to the level of excellence of the best player in the band.
The live album went gold. The film became a cult classic. But there was a cost. The tour was massively expensive. And when the dust settled, Joe found himself with little money to show for it. And the lifestyle of the tour, the drinking, the drugs, the sleepless nights, had taken a toll. Joe returned to England exhausted, emotionally drained and struggling to cope with the glare of fame. As the early 1970s progressed, Joe Cocker began slipping into a dangerous spiral. Without a strong support network around him and with easy access to drugs in West London, he drifted into a scene where dealers used him not just as a customer, but as a courier. He later admitted that they had him by the throat. He'd walk through London carrying ounces of cocaine for others, selling at low prices, losing money, and feeding his growing dependents.
Why come back?
Well, I've been on a tuition with my parents for over 9 months, you know. And that's a long time for me to be on a tuition.
Heroin entered his life as well, not injected but snorted, just enough to put him in a haze, making him fearless on the outside and increasingly fragile on the inside. By 1972, Joe's debts were mounting. He hadn't had a hit record in a while. His producer had parted ways with him. Even his steadfast friend Chris Stainton stepped back for his own sanity. Joe needed money. He needed work. And so he said yes to a tour of Australia. He had no idea it would become one of the most infamous chapters of his life. When Joe landed in Australia in October 1972, cocker fever swept the country. His first shows in Sydney were triumphs. Roaring crowds, glowing reviews, a cultural moment for Australian rock fans. But on the morning of the 14th of October, a knock came at the door of his Adelaide hotel room. Local police walked in, searched the room, and found marijuana. Joe and 5 members of his entourage were arrested. They spent only a few hours in custody, paid their fines, and left. In most countries, that would have been the end of it. In Australia, it was only the beginning. Certain politicians and media figures launched into a frenzy. They accused Joe of promoting moral decay. They argued he should be deported immediately.
Overnight, in Adelaide, John Robert Cocker drew the attention of the Australian press and Parliament. Labor backbencher Frank Stewart called for Cocker's deportation. Cocker was setting a dangerous example to Australian youth.
Joe, meanwhile, pressed on with the tour, arriving in Melbourne under headlines screaming, "Get out, Cocker!"
It's not really hard to see why the authorities in Australia didn't like Joe Cocker. He drank on stage, sweated profusely, and if he spoke any language at all, it wasn't theirs.
On the night of his Melbourne concert, Joe addressed the controversy with a mix of humour and defiance, telling the crowd he believed the country would come to its senses and legalise marijuana one day. The audience cheered wildly. But later that night, everything came crashing down. After the concert in Melbourne, Joe returned to the Chateau Commodore Hotel. Alcohol was flowing, tempers were frayed. In the early hours of the morning, an argument broke out between Joe and his girlfriend in the hotel foyer. Staff intervened, words were exchanged, a beer can was thrown. The hotel owner demanded Joe leave. The police were called. When they arrived, Joe, drunk, agitated, tired and emotional, ended up in a scuffle with officers. He was arrested again, this time for assault, resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. He spent the night in jail. And it was here that one of the most surreal anecdotes of Joe's life unfolded. Joe Cocker later recalled the moment with a blend of humour and disbelief. They put me in a cell with a bank robber and an Aboriginal man accused of murder. The bank robber seemed like a nice bloke, said he had all my albums. It was an absurd, almost cinematic moment. A global rock star at his lowest point, sitting in a police cell beside a man who had robbed a bank and who also happened to be a devoted fan. By the morning, however, the humour was gone. Australia's immigration minister had made his decision. Joe Cocker had 4 hours to leave the country. The remaining tour dates were cancelled. Fans protested. Journalists blasted the decision. But the order stood, and so Joe boarded a plane and flew home, humiliated. The Australian expulsion marked the lowest point in Joe's early career. When he returned home, his world continued to unravel. Chris Stainton left. His debts grew. Depression set in. For a period, Joe drifted into heavy heroin use. The fun-loving, high-spirited soul shouter of the late 60s seemed lost.
Joe and I were brother and sister. We understood each other. Joe was more grounded than anybody I ever knew. I think that's why he took drugs, because he was just almost immobile unless there was something to kind of stimulate him. Music did it. He couldn't sing all the time, and so he would walk through a crowd on the way to the stage and people would just be handing him pills and he would just pop them from a stranger.
Yet even in the worst moments, the music didn't entirely stop. In early 1973, Joe managed to quit heroin, but alcohol remained a constant companion. He would later describe this period starkly. I was drinking vast amounts and it never seemed to touch the sides. Drink became like heroin. I was obsessed with making sure I had enough to get through the day. On stage, the consequences were visible. In 1974, during a show in Los Angeles, Joe collapsed mid-performance after drinking heavily and using cocaine. The curtain was hastily drawn. The audience was left confused. Joe was left ashamed. He was now deep in a hole he could no longer climb out of alone. By 1976, new management and new touring commitments forced Joe to regain some discipline. He returned to live performance, touring across continents with more structure and fewer disasters.
You are so beautiful.
He was trying, slowly, painfully, to rebuild. The real transformation began in the late 1970s when Joe moved to California and met Pam Baker. Pam was warm, grounded, and steady, everything the chaotic world of rock and roll was not. She helped Joe straighten out his life. She encouraged him to seek stability. She believed in him. They married years later, but from the start she was the anchor Joe had desperately needed. With Pam by his side, Joe's health improved, his drinking reduced, and his passion for music began to return.
When he got clean, he got better. More superstardom and more in control of his life because he was driving, he was in control. And so he could make his own decisions, and he was brilliant.
In 1982, Joe was invited to duet with Jennifer Warnes on a ballad for the film, An Officer and a Gentleman. The song was Up Where We Belong. It became one of the biggest hits of Joe's career. It reached #1 in the United States, it won a Grammy, it won an Oscar, and it returned Joe to the center of the cultural conversation. Watching Joe in a tuxedo singing that song on the Oscar stage was a moment of redemption. Few rock stories can match. A decade earlier, he had been slumped in a jail cell in Melbourne. Now he was being applauded by Hollywood royalty. The comeback was complete. From the 1980s into the 2000s, Joe Cocker enjoyed a stabilized, respected career. He recorded albums, toured Europe and America, and continued delivering powerful performances even as age softened his voice slightly.
Mess up your feet. You just drink water and talk about Jesus.
He settled with Pam on a ranch in Colorado, living a quiet life of gardening, dog walking, and enjoying the countryside.
Yeah, Chili.
More than 3 decades after Woodstock, wild man Joe Cocker has become something of a homebody, walking the dogs and growing his beloved tomatoes.
Gotta start him early.
Home for the Cockers is here, tiny Crawford, Colorado.
He quit drinking. He quit smoking. He focused on his health. and he remained at heart the same gentle, humble man he had always been. Joe continued performing until the early 2000s. His final album was Fire It Up in 2012. He passed away on the 22nd of December, 2014, after a battle with lung cancer.
And to a voice remembered tonight, one of the most distinctive voices in modern times. Word today that Joe Cocker, the British soul singer, lost his battle with lung cancer at the age of 70, leaving behind a musical legacy from Woodstock to the Wonder Years.
In death, as in life, tributes poured in from across the world. Musicians spoke of his generosity. Fans spoke of the voice that had got them through heartbreaks, celebrations, and everything in between. And years later, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a recognition that cemented his place as one of the greats. Joe Cocker lived a life full of contradictions, shy yet explosive on stage, humble yet world famous, broken yet incredibly resilient. His fall was dramatic, and his redemption even more so. The night in that Australian jail cell, sitting beside a bank robber who proudly owned every one of his albums, symbolised the strange, chaotic, often absurd world Joe lived in. But what makes Joe Cocker's story truly special isn't the chaos, it's the comeback. It's the dignity he reclaimed, the music he kept making, the life he built with the woman he loved, the voice that even now feels like a hand reaching out to hold yours. Joe Cocker didn't just sing songs, he lived them. And in doing so, he gave the world something honest, something human, something unforgettable. Joe Cocker made his name at Woodstock, but not all the big bands of the time thought the festival would amount to anything. If you want to see which artists turned down the biggest music festival in history, click the thumbnail on screen.